Hello, everyone, and welcome to our listeners, welcome to our viewers, to another episode of The Edge. Today we have Dana Mirrow on as a special guest. I'm quite excited to talk to him. I know that, John, you've got some background in the past, and you know him, I guess, pretty well, but I don't. So I guess for my benefit and for our listeners' benefit, if you can kind of tell us a little bit about kind of how did your journey start? How did you get into IT? How did that involve into security? And then we'll kind of dig a little bit deeper into the world of SSE.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jay. And nice to talk to all of you. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Yeah, just to give you a little bit of background on me, my current role, I am a solutions engineer selling SSE and kind of doing, kind of educating people on what SSE is and why it's important, why people should be considering it now at this point. And given with the cloud adoption and kind of where everything sits today, threat landscape, things like that. Yeah, so I started getting into IT, I would say really early on in my life. I've the only thing I really know is computers, I would say. When I was 9 years old, I got access to a computer for the very first time. My grandmother had a computer at her house. This was a long time ago. And I was into video games as a kid, what kid isn't, right? And I saw that you could play video games on a floppy disk on the PC, and I thought that was like the coolest thing in the world. Um, so I was immediately hooked on it, right? Thinking of it as like a glorified Nintendo console sort of thing. Um, and then I made a mistake on the computer, not knowing what I was doing as a little kid. I was fumbling around with it, and I deleted some sort of shortcut on the desktop. And my cousin came back and was like, "Hey, this shortcut's missing. Like you broke the computer." And I was like freaking out, like, "Oh my gosh, like what did I do here?" Right. So I started, I had tons of idle time. This was like Thanksgiving time at my grandmother's house. So I was playing around with it and I was opening up, this is the Windows 3.11 era, so a while back, right? I go into File Manager and I'm trying to find the icon. I figured out a way to kind of bring it back and get it working again. And from there on, I was like, wow, like that was kind of cool. Like I fixed the computer, this thing. And it was very clear to me that this was more than just like a video game console. Like clearly my grandmother had it for a reason. She's not a video gamer, right? So, so from then on, I kind of was like, pivoted away, not completely away, but just more so away from like the idea of video gaming and kind of getting into computers. So, from there, I asked my dad. I said, "Hey, I really want to get a computer." And we didn't have a lot of money back then, so my dad was like, found a used computer for us to kind of get. And with a used computer, right, you tend to get a slower computer. So what do you do when you get a slower computer and you upgrade it, right? So we started to kind of put parts in it and upgrade it and kind of make it better. And I just was like hooked from then on. So growing up as a kid, it was like, okay, now what else can this computer do beyond just playing video games, right? So um, got into like writing programs at like 13 years old using Visual Basic 3.0. Started working with like Photoshop, just trying to figure out what I liked about the computer beyond the video game aspect, like what was really like interesting to me. And I think it was really, I never really found anything beyond the repairing and the upgrading of it that was like interesting to me. So um, when I got out, into the workforce, this was high school, kind of time frame. I wanted to do that for a living. I knew right away, like this is what I want to do. So I took that knowledge and that history that I had, and I got my first job doing computer repair for a retailer, not kind of like a Best Buy sort of thing, right? Um, and I got better at that, and then I kind of got like tired of doing that. I just was like, okay, what's the next thing, right? And then people were explaining to me, oh, servers, like servers are really important to businesses, and they're like computers. They're just faster computers, right? And got into servers, and then it was one of those things that servers were neat, and now virtualization was starting to take over. That's when VMware was starting to have their heyday, right? And that was becoming a thing. And I was like, wow, you could take multiple computers and put it into one and actually like make it more, you make better resource usefulness, right, out of this computer. And that was interesting to me. So I followed the VMware track, um, and while I ended up working for a company doing like server maintenance and stuff like that eventually. And VMware was part of that. And I ran into some network engineers who were a part of this company. And watching them whiteboard network drawings and diagrams was like the coolest thing to me. It was like, drawing a puzzle and like, how do we figure this out? How do we figure out the routing and the networking and all that stuff? So I was like, that's interesting. That's really cool. So I went to a community college to go get to just take some basic like Cisco networking classes to kind of see, was that something that I would be into? And I was right away. I was hooked. Like I was like, this is the direction I want to go in my life. I want to become a network person, network engineer. Started going in that direction. Got a job as a network person, network engineer, managing it. I'm managing infrastructure for a medical device manufacturer. And as part of that, right, you're working with a network. You've got all these components that are, you're passing this network traffic through. And they're like, hey, we've got these firewalls. They're part of the network, and we need you to help. We need you to install them and get them routing and working. So I got exposure to a firewall for the first time, and I was like, oh, this is kind of neat. It's a network device, but it also does more than that, right? It controls access, it allows, it blocks, all that sort of thing. And then the next gen firewall kind of movement was starting to take off at that point in time. And I got access to the new shiny next gen firewall that they gave us and said, hey, we're going to replace the old firewall with this next gen firewall. Go ahead and put it in. And I did. And I saw what it could do from a capability, visibility perspective, being able to see all the traffic that's actually happening. Before, you really didn't know what was actually happening in your network. It was really hard to tell. Now you could actually see that. So it was like, wow, as a network engineer, getting that visibility into what's happening, right? That's, and then you realize, oh my gosh, these security issues with that, right? You're seeing all the stuff that you didn't mean to allow that's actually being allowed and actually happening on your network. So you can't unsee that, once you start to see all these challenges and all this, data passing through your network that you didn't really intend for. So that's kind of my journey into sort of security is getting into the firewall side and then realizing that there's a big problem on our hands and that we need to address it. So I kind of moved away slowly from just the network centric world and kind of moved into the firewall world. And then eventually, saw the need for a solution like SSE, and kind of the data was moving away from just on premise, right, within a firewall. And now it's your perimeter is really everywhere, and you have to kind of have controls and protections around all that. So that's kind of what made me realize that the firewall is just not enough nowadays. It used to be, and now that everything's moving all over the place, it's you have to have comprehensive control everywhere.
So let's dive back a little bit, because you and I met and commiserated many times over firewalls. Truth be told, Dana was an SE for our firewall vendor, and he would walk in and we'd unload a raft of problems on him, and he'd go out and fix it. And it was fun, and we enjoyed that experience. He was one of the better SEs that we had on our account. So let's talk a little bit about what things changed. So cloud has entered the conversation, obviously, and that shifted applications outside of the four walls of the data center and the corporate America. Corporate world, really. Jay, I'm not going to try to leave you guys out of this conversation, but then we had obviously what happened in 2020. Let's talk a little bit about the role of the firewall going forward. How do you see that playing out? Is there a need for the massive corporate firewalls of the past, or are we entering into a different world?
I would say we are entering into a different world. I think that the idea before, again, when I was managing firewalls was, hey, everything's on-prem, all of our data centers are, where our data is located, and this is the safeguard, and this is what we need to be protecting, right? So they would basically pass as much data through a firewall as possible in order to get that visibility and inspection that I was talking about earlier, right? Is being able to see what's happening and being able to control it. And their ultimate goal, right, was to, of course, obviously keep the lights on, keep the business running, but secondarily, right, is to make sure that everything's secure and that our data is not ending up in the wrong hands, right? So the idea was, hey, let's invest a lot of money in these very, very large next-gen firewalls. Let's bring as much traffic in the data center through it as possible so that we can control everything going between a user on-premise to the internet, everybody coming, working from home, connecting into the data center for access to those systems. Typically with a VPN solution that people would, work out of a coffee shop, right? And they'd connect back into the data center, and that all of their internet traffic would go into this data center and go through those big firewalls in order to, reach websites, applications, things like that. And now that data is everywhere, now that people are working from home, now that COVID happened, right, and there's this hybrid remote work strategy, that solution doesn't really work too well anymore. So what you're starting to see now is people working from everywhere, trying to connect from everywhere, and the concessions that people have had to make is having to split off that traffic and go directly to these cloud applications, directly to these destinations, because if I'm working remotely and I'm hiring a bunch of people inside of, like let's say Paris, I'm here in Portland, near Portland, Oregon. If I'm in Paris and I'm connecting all the way into Portland to send my traffic out to the internet, that user experience is terrible. It's just not good. It's not going to work, right? And that's what people are starting to run into. So that's where kind of really SSE comes into play and offers that distributed kind of cloud security model it's global, right? And with SSE adoption, as people are starting to embrace that, we're reducing our reliance on the large firewalls that are in the data center, because our data is not just in the data center, right? It's inside of cloud, it's inside of SaaS applications, it's everywhere, right? So the data center is not necessarily the place where all the crown jewels are. So because of that, you don't need that very, very large firewall necessarily, because you're not sending all your traffic in the data center. You're sending definitely data center traffic, right? It's still going through that firewall, but other traffic like user traffic, things like that, with an SSE solution doesn't have to go through the data center unless you're accessing data center assets.
So let's
I want to
go ahead.
I just want to ask a slightly different question before we kind of go back to the technical stuff, because I've certainly spoken to a lot of people over the last couple of months, and there's a lot of people in the industry that are kind of a little bit resistant to change, a little bit resistant to taking away their old firewalls or removing their firewalls and taking away the networks. And having heard your story and heard kind of where you started and how you kind of took a path, I think it's similar to what me and John did. Do you think the fact that we grew up in the industry and we saw the industry change and we saw things like VMware come along and we were like, okay, that's exciting. Then we saw something else come along. We thought that's exciting. That enabled us to be a bit more open to change versus if you just have only ever done one thing. And I know we slightly digress, but you obviously speak to a lot of people as well. I'm assuming you come across the kind of people that don't want to move. Do you think that because we grew up with it made it easier?
I think so. Yeah, I think that it's funny. I took note on that question ahead of time, and what I wrote was open-mindedness, right? Because that's the challenge I do see when I talk to engineers today, firewall engineers, is they're very just like you said, right? They're very they're hesitant to listen. They're hesitant to kind of try to understand this sort of thing. They think that you're taking their job away, all these different reasons and fears. I think that you're right. I think that us seeing some of this technological advancement and what it's done for our jobs, what it's done for our companies, what it's done for a lot of things. I think when we see those advancements and how that's helped us, I think that we are receptive to change, and we're receptive to solutions making things better and addressing modern issues. Right? Yeah, 100%.
I mean, you've obviously gone from being obviously a very good firewall engineer, and now you've kind of almost totally, I wouldn't say thrown that away, because SSE is similar, the concept's similar, but you've kind of embraced it wholeheartedly. But anyway, John, sorry, I know we digress.
No, I was gonna double click on that and just ask what made you pivot, because you had success in the firewall industry, and then you obviously made a leap.
Yeah, and it's funny, Jay, you mentioned throwing it away. I actually do say that to my customers. I say I took 10 years of knowledge of next-gen firewall and I threw it away. That's kind of what I say, because a lot of it, I mean, fundamentally, right, when we're talking about access controls and stuff like that, a lot of that is sort of similar. It takes, kind of this general structure from a firewall. So there's part of that I'm definitely keeping still. Understanding a network is still really important to facilitating an SSE type of solution. So I think in those respects, it's definitely, I'm still taking that knowledge, but a lot of it I'm kind of moved away. And I think the reason for me was recognizing that I'm really not seeing my data movement anymore. Right. If I look at a firewall today in a data center, I can see everything going from the server to the internet. I can see everything going from a server to another server, that sort of thing, if it's set up properly, right? But I've got a lot of my data in AWS today, let's say, right? And I've got my data in GCP, and I've got my stuff in Azure, and I've got my stuff in Dropbox and OneDrive and all of these different cloud applications. If I'm working from home, if I'm just an average user, I'm not a firewall person for a second, and I've got my company issued, OneDrive open, and I take data from that and I exfiltrate it to another cloud solution, right? I'm not going to see that as a firewall engineer. I'm not even going to know that it happened because the firewall doesn't, that traffic's not coming into the data center. That traffic is not being inspected by that. So it's, I was losing visibility every single day, and I could see it. And, there needs to be a more modern solution that can provide me, again, that visibility. And first thing is always visibility, right? You need to be able to see what the problem is before you can control it. And every day I could see myself losing that visibility to these other solutions as cloud was kind of taking over, SaaS was taking over, right? And I knew that there needed to be a solution that could address that, and that I could get that visibility again of what's happening between a user and anything where my data would be located, any system, any cloud.
I think you raised something really critical then, because during your introduction, you said that you gained all that visibility. You could see those threats. You could look into that, and that kind of opened your eyes. And you also said about throwing away 10 years of knowledge, but actually, if you didn't have that knowledge, you didn't know about that visibility, you hadn't seen it, you wouldn't know you were losing it. So the fact that you've gone through that journey and couldn't see what was going on the network, put firewalls in place, suddenly had visibility. Oh, now we're losing it. I want to get it back. Okay, how am I going to get it back? Okay, by moving to this new kind of technology. But John, over to you for your next question.
Yeah, so let's break down the some of these. We've talked about SASE, we've talked about SSE. Can you kind of define that SASE, SSE, and do it in a way that a firewall engineer, a firewall security engineer might understand?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we talk about what SSE is, like by the Gartner term, right? Gartner created the term SSE, right? Which is a convergence of CASB, ZTNA, and Secure Web Gateway, right? If I'm a firewall person and I'm talking to somebody about Secure Web Gateway, right? Oftentimes on these next-gen firewalls, they have licensing for the ability to filter URLs, right? The ability to filter websites, the ability to do threat inspection on site access, right? So if I'm going to some malicious website and I'm pulling down some malware, I want to be able to stop that, right? If I want to stop my employees from accessing websites that they're not supposed to be accessing, right? So firewalls were able to do that traditionally. So with SSE, we still have that control. We're just abstracting that away from a firewall and moving that into the cloud, right? So the cloud is where that sort of thing's managed now. And then what we also have done with firewalls inside of an on-prem environment is we've used them for VPN connectivity, right? Concentration, right? And the purpose of that, of course, is to allow a user to access like a resource inside of a data center, right? Inside of a trusted kind of environment, right? Also, VPNs were also used for, again, what I was mentioning earlier, which is secure internet, protection, because the idea was that you had to have a VPN, connect back in the data center where all of your, again, big firewalls, big security controls, all that was all located there, and then get it inspected before it goes out to the internet, right? So that was, that's what firewalls kind of did today and did in the past. And now moving that sort of thing into the cloud is sort of where things are going. And the reason for that is, again, because of the distributed work environment. Everybody's starting to kind of work from everywhere. The VPN model sort of doesn't really scale the way that companies are needing it to scale nowadays. So you need kind of that global footprint where, if I take my system and I leave from here Portland, and I go to Paris, I take my laptop open and I want to do some work out there while I'm on vacation or something like that, right? I can't connect back into Portland to just get internet access or VPN access, right? I need to be able to connect somewhere close by, so that way I can get that same, control and inspection And that's really where SSE kind of shines, right? Is I can be connected from located in Paris to a point of presence in Paris that does all that same inspection that a firewall would do. But everywhere in the world, right? Having that control. So just taking those traditional firewall controls away from an on-premise firewall box and moving that sort of thing into the cloud. So it's really that. Then also taking the CASB piece, which is the Cloud Access Security Broker. A lot of people don't know what that is. When I explain, what is a CASB, they know what it stands for, they know the acronym, but they don't actually know what it is. And the idea with that is, Secure Web Gateway was really important a long time ago when the world was just a web world. But now, as we've kind of adopted SaaS, adopted cloud, the world doesn't really communicate in a web way, right? Where everything's just URL based, right? There's a lot of APIs, there's a lot of JSON calls that are happening between a user and these cloud applications. So being able to control those calls that are being made and understand them, interpret them to, again, provide visibility into how your users are interacting with cloud applications, how to control that access in line, right? So if I'm doing an upload into a OneDrive or a Dropbox or something like that, I want to be able to see that that's happening. I want to be able to control it. I want to be able to understand what OneDrive instance, what Dropbox instance, because that definitely matters, right? The difference between maybe your OneDrive instance and a ransomware operator's OneDrive instance, right? So, yeah.
So I have a question about SSE and the journey, because I get asked this all the time, and I've got an answer, and John's got an answer, like, where do you start your SSE journey? I very much see SSE is kind of sitting on top of this strategy of zero trust, right? It's users to applications, wherever the applications may be. But where would you suggest that people start their journey? What would be the part of the kind of architecture that they should start with first, and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I get asked that sometimes. I also have customers that I talk to that they, depending on their situation, they'll go with one portion of SSE, and they never bite off the whole thing. They never say, I'm going to go SSE and I'm going to buy SSE today and I'm going to deploy it, right? It's always one component of those things that make up SSE, right? They'll go with that, maybe because there's a gap in their environment, right? And then from there, they'll kind of expand onto the other solutions. If you were asking me as a consultant which one I should go with, I would say I think that CASB is probably the most important thing right now. That's because of the fact that, again, a lot of the traditional firewalls of traditional controls were always around Secure Web Gateway. And VPN is still there. It's got its security vulnerabilities, security issues, but they're well defined, well understood. It's important to move away from a VPN technology in the future towards something zero trust network access oriented. But that it works today. It can be slow, it can be non-performant, that sort of thing, but it does work, right? But where people have gaps right now is in CASB, is in cloud visibility and cloud control, right? From a SaaS perspective, from a public cloud perspective, what people are doing before a CASB solution, what they were doing is they were building the controls in their public cloud environments, in their SaaS environments. And that doesn't really scale, because if you think about it, if you look at how many cloud applications are being used by a particular enterprise, it's going to be in the thousands usually. Is contrary to what people think. I talked to a lot of customers, and I asked them how many cloud applications they run. They say somewhere around 200 to 300, and then when they actually start to test out an SSE solution, they realize it's like 10x that, right? And then they're like, wow, like there's all these applications they didn't even realize were in their environment that were being used by different business units within the organization. So being able to have a unified solution that can see all of that communication between all of your users and all your cloud applications, and then control it in one place. That's really important, because when you realize you have thousands of applications, you can't just go to each cloud application and say, I'm going to control it this way, I'm going to control it that way. It just doesn't scale. You don't have the resources for it.
No,
Got OIT.
What I would love is a place that people could start would be the visibility element. That's what I would love, because and I was thinking about this when I was on a plane the other day, that we also see, and I talk a lot about when people have implemented SSE, they're like, oh, we didn't know this was happening. And it would certainly help you know where to start if you had the visibility that you gain from implementation before. And I know that's a bit of a magic wand and we can't do that. But even if you look at ZTNA, you're like, a lot of people don't realize what their remote users are accessing. They don't realize what websites they might be going to. They don't realize what cloud stuff they're going to. Because as we've talked about on this, when you were on-prem, you had that visibility, your users moved, you lost the visibility, and suddenly you're like, you think this is what's going on, but you don't necessarily know. And you can base it on what was happening historically, but you know that's not going to be true because the users aren't there anymore. But yeah, I mean, John, I think it's worthwhile asking. I think you've taken skills that you've learned in the firewall industry. What skills that you learned have helped you with SSE, and what would you advise to people that want to enter the arena today?
Yeah, I would say the skills that I learned working with firewalls, how that's helped me is a lot of, again, the controls that have been moved away from the firewall into the cloud and an SSE solution, right? So I was very familiar before even knowing what SSE was or working for a company that sells SSE. I was very familiar with what URL filtering was. I was very familiar with web access. So that concept was very clearly translatable, right? Going from, URL filtering on a firewall to a secure web gateway solution in an SSE platform. So that part was like, okay, great. I can take that away from the firewall and move that into the cloud. That makes sense. The zero trust network access point piece, at first I didn't really understand what that was. And actually a lot of people don't still, because of how different it is from a VPN architecture. People are used to the VPN world. Hey, I've got to build this VPN concentrator on my firewall. I've got to allow traffic inside to form that VPN connection, all this sort of thing, right? And then ZTNA sort of flips that around completely, and it's more of an outbound connection. But just understanding those security benefits, I think is really important from a ZTNA perspective, being able to understand a lot of the breaches nowadays, right, have been around VPN, the credential theft and VPN, authenticated users basically that are being operated by a ransomware operator or some sort of adversary, right? They're VPNing into a network and they're getting a lot of access that they shouldn't be getting, right? So ZTNA was, if you explain to me what ZTNA was, that it's least privileged access essentially to data center applications, but then also in a way where I don't have to punch holes inside of my data center, inside of my network in order to facilitate that access, I would be all ears, because from my perspective, I even ran a firewall here at my house for a VPN, and I had trouble sleeping at night knowing that VPN appliance was always under attack by people on the internet, right? So
I think the good thing is, as well, is it gives you that visibility back, as we've talked about before, right? You get to see what people are doing, what they're connecting to, why they're connecting. I mean, I've implemented SSE solutions, and I certainly the thing that frightened me the most was it gave me visibility into cleanup that should have happened. Like we would have users that would have started in one area of the business and moved into another area of the business, but nobody had cleaned up their Active Directory access or their access to file servers or whatever it may be. So, and we also found that there were products running on people's machines that were calling out to access systems that had long gone, and all this stuff that we just didn't know with a VPN. And therefore, if somebody does get compromised, you're not going to know, right? You can't see. I mean, yes, we still have tools on-prem that if they actually get on-prem, you might see some stuff going on. I'm not going to say that's not true, but you couldn't see that to and from, and that worried me.
Absolutely. I actually think that's a good point, right? The technical debt aspect. When we have these traditional solutions that have been, migrated from one hardware appliance to another hardware appliance to another hardware appliance, when the technology inherently hasn't changed, right? VPN's been around for, I don't know how long, 20, 30 years, something like that. It's very easy to think like, hey, I can just migrate my policies over, right? I'll migrate them over to this new appliance and then turn on the new appliance, get the VPN working, and it's like, hey, it's all set. But what you're doing is you're carrying over a lot of mistakes, a lot of human error, a lot of overly permissive policies, a lot of things like that into this new solution. And when you do that, you are not getting that visibility and that control that you need in this day and age, right? So I do like to position ZTNA as a fresh start of sorts, right? Because you can then, you have your VPN today. As you start to migrate to a ZTNA solution, you don't have to, it's not, and that's the other thing I tell people, right? It's not a big bang switch, right? Because that's scary. VPN's been around for how long? You're gonna, you can't just turn off the VPN one day and turn on ZTNA and you're all set, right? It's a phased approach that you need to take. But what you can do is you can, look at your environment today in 2023 and go, okay, these are the things I need to allow access to. Are my users able to do their job and access the right resources? Great. I don't need all this other VPN stuff that's been from 20 years ago that's calling out to systems that aren't even online anymore, right? I don't need that anymore. So then they can start to kind of really just have a well-defined policy set of systems that they actually need to access, and then the rest of it can kind of, go off into the sunset.
I think a lot of the tools that we're implementing today, a lot of this talk of zero trust and a lot of the technologies that exist is forcing us to do that cleanup that we historically, and I'll say we because I was involved in it, that we didn't necessarily do, because IT has always been about making it easy for the users to access things and simple for us to support. And zero trust changes that, and therefore is really most people move house for instance and just pack up loads of boxes, move house, never unpack the boxes, and then they'll move house again and they'll take the same boxes they've never unpacked and move them again. And it now's the time to kind of sit down and go, we need to tidy up. And I know, John, you're a believer in that as well. So
Yeah, I may be a believer in it, but do I practice it? I don't know. Question: one of the things you didn't call out, and I think it was just an item, networking. So we both kind of got our starts and our excitement around networking. We saw the diagrams on the whiteboard, and that everything kind of clicked. But being a firewall engineer also means that you have strong networking background. Mm-hmm. Now, in the SSE space, there are some vendors that say, networking is just going to be a cafe. That's going to be, you don't need to worry about networking. It's all going to take care of itself. Internet's going to take care of everything. But I'm curious to get your point of view on that, because I see it as networking still needs to continue. There's a lot of complexity involved with moving packets. It has a future. But what would you say to that security engineer that, is looking at SSE and they're hearing the message like, oh, everything's just going to be a cafe. We're just going to, default route out to the internet. Network guy, you need to just go find something else to do.
No, yeah, I think that the role is changing, of a network person. I don't think it's going away, at least not anytime soon. I think that what you're starting to see with some people who have overly embraced the cloud is the cost associated with that. And then, a pullback right back into the data center for a lot of systems. So I think there's use cases for cloud usage and there's use cases for on-prem. And as long as you have an on-prem environment, you need to be able to protect that, just like you can protect your cloud solutions with an SSE type of platform, right? So I think the firewall is still very much alive. I think that the need for segmentation and control within the data center is still, really important. If for some reason a system gets compromised inside the data center, I really don't want that data center system to be able to communicate with every other system in the data center and start to, exfiltrate really sensitive data to a internet connected data center, a server or something like that, right? So there's still that security risk, security challenge there. And as long as that still exists, then you need a firewall or some sort of control in order to protect that. And as long as that exists, then you have, you always need the plumbing and the networking associated with making sure that the data center systems are getting that security control and security inspection, but also in a performant way, right, where you're not slowing down the data center from processing as fast as it needs to, right? So, yeah, totally agree.
So, as you kind of look at the skills you need, and we've covered a number of them, transitioning from firewall to SSE. But what we really haven't talked about are from an engineering perspective, what are the key skills you need to have to be successful in the SSE space?
I think that understanding how networks work is really important for me. I think I work with a lot of peers in my organization who come from a lot of different walks of life, right? They come from maybe the DLP space, or they come from the endpoint security space, or just different areas. And they struggle in a lot of places because when we're looking at SSE, SSE is really a network security solution, if you think about it, right? It's if I am a user and I've got my laptop open and I'm connecting to a cloud application, this SSE solution would be decrypting traffic, it's analyzing traffic, it's preventing it in line, it's facilitating that access as well. So it's doing all these things, much like a network engineer would facilitate access to the internet from a data center, right? It's just abstracted into the cloud, right? So understanding how networks work is really translates well into SSE, because you still have a lot of those types of things to consider, right? Performance related to network issues, decryption, again, mentioning that, right? Certificate management, all that stuff that we had to do on-prem for doing decryption, we still have to do that. It's just now in the cloud, right? So taking that knowledge of networking and kind of firewalling and having that in SSE, it is very useful for me personally. I do have to help a lot of my peers who don't come from that background.
How about identity? We haven't talked a little bit about identity, because that's a major component of SSE. It all starts, we all say it all starts with identity. What recommendations would you have to a security engineer that probably comes from more of that traditional background? How do they get up to speed on identity?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, identity is critical, right? Because if you're trying to adopt a zero trust initiative or zero trust kind of methodology, right? And a zero trust is not a product. I know we talk about ZTNA. ZTNA is a product. It's zero trust network access, which is different from zero trust, right? Zero trust is a methodology, right, of defining the least privileged access. So understanding who, what, where, when, and why, whenever defining a policy for access is really important there. So identity is where that starts with the who, right? When network engineers before, and myself, I'm included in this, I'm sure you both are too, right, is we would build policies around IP address. We would say this IP 10 dot whatever can access these systems, right? And we thought that was an identifier that was trustworthy and meaningful. And what we're realizing nowadays with the sophistication of attacking tools and spoofing addresses and things like that, that really isn't good enough anymore, right? So being able to define who and having identity in everything that you do is critical nowadays, because the IP address is just not a trustworthy identifier.
Yeah, I mean, we often have conversations about where should people start, and I mean, maybe that's where they should start, right, with an identity provider of some form, or at least get understanding identity. I want to pivot slightly. We've talked a bit about what you need to kind of move into SSE. But why would you move into SSE? Why would a firewall engineer or a network engineer? What would be the benefits for them of doing so?
Well, I mean, I think that the kind of touched on a little bit before, but the relevance of a firewall on-prem is diminishing slowly. It's not going to go away, I don't think, anytime soon, but it is diminishing as cloud adoption continues to happen, as cloud costs become cheaper. I think you'll see more of adoption of that away from the data center. I think that companies they don't want to manage data centers. It's more of like they need to manage a data center because there's no better way. But these companies, whatever industry vertical they're in the business of generating revenue related to that industry, right? Not managing data centers. They're not in the business of that. So if they can offload it to a service, they're going to, right? So I think that that's one thing to consider. And as the cloud adoption continues to happen, and as users continue to remain off premise, if you see that continuing, I think that a solution like SSE is going to get looked at some point. It's going to have to, because you're going to have, I mean, when I've seen this with tons of customers nowadays I talk to, is when, as they've adopted this remote work strategy, they've had performance issues. Almost all of them have had performance issues, and they've had to do one of two things. They've had to adopt a solution like SSE to maintain that control, or they've had to allow the users to directly access cloud applications, which creates a huge visibility gap, because now you can no longer see or protect the user when they're communicating with certain cloud applications, even if it's a cloud application that's owned by some sort of adversary, right? So it's coming. It's just slowly, maybe. In some situations it's faster than others, but yeah, I can see that trend.
Yeah, I was at an event actually with John a few weeks ago, and whilst I was sitting having lunch, someone said to me he didn't see the reason for moving in the SSE direction because his company had started to enforce hybrid work, and therefore people were starting to go back into the office. And I said, okay, but applications are still in the cloud. A lot of things have moved, data's moving to the cloud, and you've just said, he said to me, hybrid work. And I said, okay, how many people did you have working remotely before? And he said, none. And I said, how many people will you have who need to work from home at least one day a month moving forward? And he's like, everybody will need to do that. And I'm like, well, there you go. Like, I honestly don't think we're going to go completely back to where we were. We may spend more time in the office than we did, and there are pros and cons of that, and there's a whole different podcast around that. But I don't think, and I certainly don't believe that we're just going to go back 100% like we did before. So the world has made a shift. Maybe we are going to step back a little bit, but for me, that's where the power of the technology comes from, is being able to protect people that have, wherever they are, whether they're in a coffee shop or at home or on the road or in an airplane or wherever it may be. But John, time's ticking away. I guess one more question from you before we get onto the fun stuff.
Yeah, I think it was more of a kind of a summary here. I think, we started off this conversation around firewalls and the role that they played within the enterprise. And I think the key takeaway here is for somebody who is a security engineer, firewall engineer, more traditional in the approach, or maybe their company is, and they're diving into or dipping their toe into the SSE lake. I think the key point is what firewalls did is they were in line. They were in line with those applications that were reaching out to the internet or enforcing protections against the threat of the internet. In this day of distributed applications, a distributed workforce, that physical firewall can no longer be in line. And that's really what SSE does, is it from a software perspective, cloud deployed, points of presence globally. It allows you to be in line and not only achieve security, but also speed and performance of applications. So that's the critical piece. And that would be my summary here is you got to be in line to be secure.
Yeah, I mean, I can't agree enough.
Yeah.
Do you want to go fun question number one, John?
Oh, sure. Yeah, because I know Dana spends a lot of time in Asia. So I'm curious because we'll start with food. What's your favorite meal you've had so far in Asia?
I would say, okay, yeah. So I was in Siem Reap, Cambodia. I spent a lot of time in Cambodia in particular. I really like the area out there. And I was going to Angkor Wat, and I don't know if you know what Angkor Wat is. I think it's the largest religious temple in the world. It's I think originally a Hindu Buddhist temple. Anyway, so when you go over there, so I was there in August of last year, and August in Cambodia is extremely humid and hot. Think of it like a Florida summer. So quite humid. So it's pretty exhausted because I was, doing a lot of hiking, a lot of looking at the temples that day on the way to Angkor Wat, and so we were doing a good amount of that. And there was this like little cafe that's kind of at the base of the walkway before you get over to Angkor Wat, and they had this Khmer style. Khmer is the language that they speak in Cambodia. It was this Khmer style like cold noodle soup that they had. It had like lemongrass. It was just really like a green kind of broth, and it was cooler. And it just like, I don't know if it was the situation or like the time of the day, given that how hot and humid it was. Like that was like something that sounded really good, a cold soup, but with noodles in it and fish. It was like almost like a cold fish curry soup or something like that. Anyway, it was the right place, right time, and it just tasted, super good. And that would probably be my favorite food that I've had. Aside from that, probably sushi in Tokyo, of course, right? Who would like sushi in Tokyo? I'm a big sushi guy, so when I come out here, when I'm here in the U.S. eating sushi, it's all good. But when I go over there, it's just like the level of attention and care that they put to everything that they do, even at the places that are like the smaller places, not the like well-established names in Tokyo for like sushi. It's all really good.
Yeah, oftentimes it's the small hole in the wall locations, and it's just the timing works out. Maybe it's the experience you're in at the moment, or just the ambiance. That's what makes an amazing meal. So, Jay, over to you.
Oh, you've just thrown Angkor Wat into the conversation. We could have a whole conversation on that. I spent 5 days doing all of those temples, and oh, I guess the question's gonna be around Asia, because I love spending time in Asia as well. And I want to ask you, well, I'll ask you two questions. What is your favorite temple in the Angkor Wat area? And the second question is, outside of Cambodia, what would be your favorite place you've ever been within Asia?
I would say, as far as the temple goes, I forget the name of it, and I feel bad for not remembering it, but it's the one that's pretty iconic outside of Angkor Wat. It's the one where the trees are rooting over the actual temple, because it was, I forget the name of it. I don't know if you remember.
It's called, it's called Ta Prom.
Top row,
It's the Tomb Raider one. Yes, amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah, they talk about that a lot over there. Is they tell you, they remind you that this is where the Tomb Raider was filmed. I'm very proud of that, which is really cool. That I think that's really neat, just to see how the tree has adapted to its environment, right, for survival purposes, right? I mean, these trees are sitting on top of this, massive temple, and are pulling, these roots are going all the way over the temple into the ground to grab that water and that structure and safety, right? For I just think that's the neatest thing to see, like Mother Nature kind of doing its thing when it's not messed with. So favorite place in Asia would also probably be Japan for me. I love Japan a lot. If it was a little bit less expensive, I'd probably live there, have some sort of residency there, something like that. I'm a big culture person, so I think that the Japanese culture, as well as the Cambodian culture, they're very considerate, they're very respectful, they're very kind people, and I just love being around that energy. Right? Is just it's really nice. And I struggle sometimes coming home back to the US, where it's not necessarily that way all the time, right? It's more opportunistic, I would say, out here. But out there, and then also just in Tokyo in particular, how well things are structured, right? The trains, how many people are there, and how well the cities ran, given how many people there are. I mean, I think it's the largest population city per capita, I think, in the world. And it doesn't feel that way when you're there, versus other cities you might go to that are much smaller, that they're a little more chaotic.
I mean, I was very lucky to live in Japan for a while. So, I mean, we could talk about Japan forever as well, but I'm always amazed that it's not a really touristy destination. I mean, I was there in the early 2000s, and there were no Western people. Like, you would literally, if you bumped into somebody else on the street, you would say, "Do you want to have a coffee?" Because you just saw nobody. I think that's probably changed recently. But I mean, it's a beautiful country. Like you said, the people are nice. That I love the temples. I mean, very different in kind of Angkor Wat, or very different in the Chinese style, but amazing. And I know, John, you spent some time in Japan recently. We could have a whole podcast about that. But I mean, I want to personally thank you for coming on. This has been an amazing conversation. I think you've dropped some really great insights. I like the journey that you've taken. I like your advice to other engineers that may be transitioning or are thinking about transitioning. It's really great to meet you. And John, any final words from you?
No, it's a great conversation, and I know Dana and I have been talking about getting you on and having this conversation around how do you transition from more traditional firewall security engineer to SSE. So thank you for your insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And finally, I'm glad we got it together finally.
Absolutely.
So
thank you.
Yeah.